Thank you for coming and inviting me to this conference today. It's very exciting to be here. Is my presentation coming up? So while I get started, I just want to mention one thing. So I noticed this conference, it's very similar to, it's not an issue with Kiev, it's not an issue with Ukraine. This happens in New York, this happens in Silicon Valley. These blockchain conferences tend to be filled with lots of men and not so much women. I would encourage everybody to reach out to your networks of women and try to get them engaged in blockchain. I think the promise of blockchain is really about democratizing and decentralizing the legacy power structures, providing opportunities to those who maybe are underrepresented, and redistributing wealth to those maybe underrepresented. Really, this room should be filled with more women, more men, more underrepresented groups. So I encourage you to include those people from your networks as well. I normally speak about infrastructure. I build a project that is a developer tool for developers on the Ethereum platform. It's a very technical presentation typically, but I understood that this particular conference and this audience might not be a developer conference, but more broadly a blockchain conference. So I decided to change my presentation. So I will not be speaking about Infura and developing Ethereum applications on the Ethereum platform. If that really frustrates you, and you were really here to hear about Infura, please come find me. I'll be here all day. Happy to talk to you about Infura. But today I wanted to talk about token design and effective token design for end-sided markets. So if you're working on a project where a token might become a part of that project, I want to talk a little bit about lessons and things that we've learned about building effective and efficient tokens to support your decentralized project built on a blockchain. So let's see if we can get the presentation. It should be PDF. I need to invite some of the people from downstairs to come upstairs. I hope that you're able to understand in my English. So, okay. Maybe that's why people aren't here, because they don't understand my English. Yes, perfect. Okay. So, as I said, my name is Mishael Wuehler. I'm Director of Infrastructure at Consensus. I'll talk a little bit about Consensus in a minute, but my title is going to be Effective Token Design for End-Sided Markets, and we'll talk what that means. So who am I? By introduction, again, my name is Mishael Wuehler. I'm Director of Infrastructure at Consensus. I'm also a founder of a project called Infura, which is a development platform for developers who are building applications on top of the Ethereum ecosystem. Infrastructure is very important to me. It's really interesting. All of this activity we talk about on blockchain and all of these fantastic ideas, all the ICOs, all of these projects, at the end, if the underlying protocol of the blockchain is not able to scale, none of this is going to work. So it's really important to me to build kind of that base layer of infrastructure. Very much like the internet, maybe 25 or 30 years ago, it was very limited in its ability to scale and to really support lots of users. And lots of smart people over time continued to build the internet infrastructure to where it is today, which enables us to stream video and chat and do all things in real time, which is amazing. So by education, I have a master's degree in information systems management. I also have an MBA from the University of Booth of Chicago, Booth School of Business. In my career, I have a long career in technology. I spent my first 10 years as an internet engineer. I worked at a dot-com startup in the late 90s. So I've gone through kind of this euphoria of a new technology, and everyone gets excited about it, and lots of investment goes in. Some of it fails, some of it is a scam, but some of it actually is legitimate, as things like Google and Facebook and Amazon came through. I spent 11 years at Bank of America in the technology infrastructure organization. Among other things, I managed middleware messaging for global markets. My last role was a COO for software engineering or global engineering, which was about a 1,000-person organization inside Bank of America. I joined Consensus in the summer of 2016. And my blockchain experience, I started to get really involved in Bitcoin in 2011. I got really excited. I read everything I could. When I found out about Ethereum in early 2014, even more excited. I got really super excited about Ethereum. I started the New York City Ethereum meetup group that summer. And today that group has over 6,500 members. It's the second largest Ethereum meetup in the world. So what is Consensus? So Consensus is a venture production studio. We are building decentralized applications and various developer and end user tools for blockchain ecosystems, and we focus primarily on Ethereum. Our primary focus is building, so less focus on the price of Ether and trading Ether. We're actually just building applications on top of Ethereum. We think if we do that, the rest will follow. So we're global. We're a global organization. We have about, right now, 850 blockchain experts, entrepreneurs, computer scientists, designers, engineers, business leaders across all 6 continents. Here in Kiev, Consensus has partnerships with several organizations. We partner with DapDev Consulting, I think, who is sponsoring this event. We partner with Luxoft, if you've heard of Luxoft. And just this week, I've also met Spexo, the Spexo group. So looking forward to more partnerships in Ukraine. I feel like the engineering talent and interest in blockchain in Ukraine is very strong. So it's a great place to be. So Consensus, we focus on 5 primary areas. We have infrastructure, so that's what I work on. I work on development tools to maintain core developer tools and clients. We build products, so we incubate products on top of the Ethereum blockchain and try to bring them to market. We have a capital arm, so that's more like a traditional VC arm. It was seeded with $50 million and has started to make investments primarily in decentralized applications. We have education, so we recognize that there's a very large shortage in education and Ethereum development. So Solidity, smart contract developers, executives who need to understand more fully the kind of the benefits of decentralization and building on top of blockchain. And then, of course, we have a services group who partners with governments and organizations to build internally proof of concepts and different things for the Ethereum blockchain. So our thesis is the digital economy is headed for decentralization. And so you can see kind of the evolution of how the internet has gone over the last several years. With the initial Web 2.0, you had this platform economy. So these are centralized services, like Facebook, for example, or PayPal. Facebook is kind of a centralized service, and every interaction that you have within the Facebook platform is controlled and managed and monetized by Facebook. Facebook is making billions of dollars off of every little bit of interaction we do. Then around 2010, we saw this kind of transition into what we call the sharing economy. So a really great example of that is Uber. Uber's here in Ukraine, in Kiev. I love it. It's really fantastic. I used to struggle when I came to Kiev, when I get a taxi, to really explain where am I going. I couldn't speak Russian, they don't speak English, so it was really hard. Uber made it very easy. I can just punch in where I'm going, where I'm coming from. All I have to say is like "Привет" and "Спасибо" at the end, and that's all I have to do, and I get to my location. but that still required a pretty strong intermediary. So Uber is still sitting kind of really in the middle of that transaction and extracting lots of rent from that transaction. It's not that they're not doing anything. They are creating the software that makes all this happen. They're creating the reputation for the drivers and for the passengers, so you have kind of this comfort. I wouldn't feel comfortable jumping in a random stranger's car in a foreign country if I don't know, maybe I get kidnapped. So Uber kind of provides that intermediary that does that, but they also charge quite a bit. And then in 2015, we saw with the advent initially in 2009 of Bitcoin, and then even more fully in 2015 with Ethereum, this opportunity for peer-to-peer economy, which is truly distributed, decentralized, and really you have more of an opportunity to eliminate some of those intermediaries who are extracting rent, and you can actually interact directly with people. And that's what we've started to see with all of these ICO projects, as kind of these projects of peer-to-peer interactions, value creation that eliminates a lot of that extra rent extraction by third parties who are giving limited experience. So what can be digitized? This is just a few examples that we see, but there's obviously many, many more, but we're seeing lots. So you have real estate. You can digitize real estate. You can digitize oil. You can digitize human attention. So my attention right now, Facebook is monetizing a lot of my attention. Platforms like Instagram, they monetize my attention. In a truly peer-to-peer marketplace, you can maybe perhaps flip that a little bit and retain some of that value that's being created for yourself. Diamonds, financial products, etc. There are many, many more things that we're seeing, and there's lots of ICO projects that are exploring and trying to build platforms, marketplaces that decentralize this. So this has given the rise to what we call multi-sided markets. So multi-sided markets are companies that are able to create digital marketplaces for their own services and products, and these are built and enforced by Ethereum smart contracts. So on the left, we have kind of this current situation, the centrally operated and governed platforms. So again, Uber is a great example. I think people here understand Uber and how it works. Uber is great, but it's an intermediary that in the end, it does own your identity. It owns the pricing decisions that get made. It controls the openness of the platform. So for example, my identity, yes? You have a question? It's a friend of mine. So you have like your identity that's owned by Uber, for example. So I don't know if you have it here in Ukraine yet, but in the United States we have a competing platform called Lyft. So if I'm a driver on Uber, and I decide one day, you know what, I don't like Uber anymore. I'm frustrated with Uber. I want to start driving for Lyft. Well, I cannot take my reputation and all of this kind of years of reputation and scores that I have with Uber and move it over to Lyft. Uber controls it. They maintain it. They're not going to let me have it. So I have to go to Lyft and I have to basically start all that over. So these intermediaries really have control over your identity. So what's the difference if we go to a peer-to-peer governed marketplace through a decentralized ledger like Ethereum? So in this condition, the blockchain governance itself replaces that intermediary. So this allows individuals to own their own identity, to have more control over the pricing. And at the end of the day, what this means more value retention for the contributions made by the participants in the network. So building a business is hard, and I'm not talking about a token economy or a n-sided market or a two-sided market. Just in general, a business is hard. Why? You have to find a product market fit, and that can be really difficult to achieve. You also have to find customers. Like somehow you have to market, you have to advertise, you have to locate these customers. And in the end, you have to, if you are generating profit, you have to continually tune your model and continue to be aware of the market. So maybe if you're profitable, obviously that will start to attract competition. Maybe those competitions have a much better idea of the current market conditions, and they're able to start eroding at your market share. So you really constantly have to be remodeling, tuning your business model. So building a two-sided marketplace like Uber is even harder. So you need to facilitate a relationship between two interdependent groups of customers and to create a value proposition. So you have to make itself easy to find. You have to aggregate an audience. You have to make sure that the costs are low. So companies such as Airbnb or Uber, when they enter new markets, it can be very expensive to get it right. So there's been reports that for Uber to enter a new market, and I'm not even saying probably a market the size of Kiev or like New York City or San Francisco, but just a simple town, they spend $1 million just to get into the market and stabilize the market. And so that's a two-sided market. Now let's talk about multi-sided markets. So this is even harder, primary reason being communication. So in a two-sided market, you have two parties. There's just one communication channel between those two parties that need to be configured. If you have a multi-sided market, the number of communication channels is n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So for example, if you have 10 market participants, that could lead to be up to 45 unique communication channels. So those 10 different interested parties are able to communicate. Also, it's difficult to find the optimal pricing structure between many partners. It's really difficult to predict because if you've got 10 market participants, maybe one or two of them perceive the value of the network to be very high, and their willingness to pay will be very high. Whereas maybe some of the others feel like they're getting little value. They want to participate, but they have little value, so pricing for them should be really low. So it's really hard to really identify and hone in on the optimal pricing structure in a multi-sided market. And then ultimately, in these markets, centralized control of the marketplace is really hard to manage. We've seen this with Bitcoin, we've seen this with Ethereum. Once you launch the market into the public, it becomes really hard, and I would say almost impossible to centrally control it. We've seen this with the struggles in Bitcoin for several years, back and forth arguing we should do this, we should do that, and in the end you had a split, and now we have Bitcoin Cash. So once you kind of relinquish centralized control of these markets, it becomes impossible to manage kind of the ongoing maintenance and support of those markets. So token economies are multi-sided markets. And so token economies are complex. They're complex ecosystems because they have to coordinate effectively to achieve network goals for all the participants. So all the participants have to engage in productive behavior to maintain this value proposition. So for example, you need to make sure you have a thick market. You have to have enough participants in the market. Although you also have to make sure you don't have too many participants. So if you get too much network congestion, it can lead to the failure of the market. And we've seen this in Bitcoin, for example, or Ethereum, in periods where the congestion in the market became so high that the fees in the market start to get so high that it becomes impossible to transact. CryptoKitties, if you're familiar with that particular event on the Ethereum network, flooded the market with transactions. They just started to queue. Nobody could get their transactions through. It just becomes very frustrating for your users. So getting an optimal level of participation in your users is challenging as well. And then finally, of course, you have to keep your market participants safe. They want to know that the marketplace is operating and behaving the way that they expected it would, the way that they hope it would, the way that their desired behaviors anticipate that it should. The underlying blockchain provides a lot of that trust, but you have to build that layer of security and transparency on top as well as you're building your multi-sided market. So also token economies are multilateral. So by default, each participant or customer type significantly makes contributions to the virtuous cycle of the marketplace. So if you remove one of those market participants, so maybe they get disillusioned or disenfranchised or don't feel like they're getting their needs met in the marketplace, that potentially could break the whole entire virtuous cycle of that market. And improperly identifying or ignoring the needs, drivers, motivations, incentives of one of these customer groups will ultimately likely lead to the failure of your marketplace. So here's the difficulties we're seeing. And when I say we, I'm talking about Consensus and some of the consulting we've been doing with projects who are building tokens and token economies. So first, this is uncharted territory. There's lots of groups that are rushing, trying to be first to the market. Maybe not fully taking the time to research and develop and understand exactly all of the nuances that need to be considered before they create this marketplace. A second is clients maybe only understand one or two of the market participants. So if you have a marketplace that takes into account 5 or 6 or 7 different user groups who need to participate in the market, maybe you come from a background where you really understand 1 or 2 of them and their needs and their expectations. But if you don't fully understand all 5 or 6 or 7, you're going to limit their ability to have their desired benefits and desired needs met. Another is oversimplification of the game theory and the nuances of the market design. So market design is really challenging. It's a discipline in economics that's been around a long time, way before cryptocurrencies came along. So designing markets is difficult and challenging. So unless you have someone on your group or an advisor with strong economic background, a strong experience in market design and game theory, you may oversimplify some of those game theory assumptions that you're making that should make your marketplace work. And then finally, there's this discomfort in losing control of the decentralization. So if you're in a position now where you have more control over the market, it might be hard for you to release some of that control in favor of decentralization. So that's another challenge. So what do? We validate marketplace viability with our customers. So we use a design thinking methodology to deep dive into use cases. This is really meant to really try to address the needs of all the users. We identify customer needs, create an empathy map, create customer journey maps. We do a rough prototype, for example. You can do this on paper. And then you create a business model canvas. So this is more of like a traditional business model creation process using design thinking methodology, if you're familiar with that. So an example. So this is just a simplified example of maybe something that we thought and then what we found out. So say you have an objective to create a fungible token into a project-based learning system to reward student progress. So you might think, okay, so in this marketplace we have students and we have this maybe quasi-government institution that will attest to a student learning something. Going through a workshop, you realize that there's many, many more participants in the market. You've got teachers, you've got the government, you've got donors, corporate donors, you've got specific use case donors, and others. And you really need to take into account all of their expectations and desired benefits. So you can integrate like a lean methodology, which is a traditional business model canvas type process using a design thinking workshop. There's lots of literature that you can find on that. You can partner with a company like IDEO. They're kind of one of the larger groups that does this sort of thing. And then we propose layering on top of that a token utility canvas that will help to inform decisions in the future as you make your design, as you make your business model into a token model. So token design, it's an iterative process. You have obviously the token utility canvas. I'll talk about that. We won't have time to go through each of these 4. You have token mechanics. So what are the tokens for? How are they getting used? How do they get transferred one to another? What are the expectations of use for the tokens? Legal review, obviously, you don't want to go to prison by releasing a token. Different jurisdictions have different expectations from a legal point of view. In the United States, specifically in New York, it's very strict. And so we have to be very careful in our legal reviews on how we're creating tokens. And finally, there's actually the token design itself. How many tokens will you create? How many will you sell? How many will you keep for yourself? So all of that is kind of like iterative process that goes back and forth. So I'll dig into the token utility canvas. Got a few minutes, I've got to wrap this up. But so your initial focus when you create your token utility canvas would be define who the token participants are, what are their desired behaviors, what are their incentives, and then create some proposed solutions for tokens. Then you prioritize, create trade-offs. So what are the token functions? Which tokens might be needed? Specify corresponding utility for each of those tokens, and then start to narrow down and shortlist the necessary tokens needed. So that leads to your token utility canvas, which I'll show an example next. But of course, then from there, you've got to test your token utility. You don't want to just release this into the public on a production network where real value is at risk without understanding unintended consequences. So you test with a small set of users, maybe on a test network. It can be challenging because in many cases when there isn't real value at risk, if you're just playing with fake money, you may not get the expected behaviors in your test, but you may at least get some informed decisions on how to refine that model. So this is what a template would look like. You have your platform, you identify who your users are, what are their desired behaviors, name your tokens, maybe you have one, maybe you have two, what is the actual utility of that token, and so let's look at a real example. So this is a simplified example of a token curated registry, if you've heard of those. So the goal of a token curated registry is to decentrally curate a list or a registry that has intrinsic economic incentive for token holders to curate the list contents judiciously. So who are the users in this case? We've got the curators of the list. So what do they want? They want to make sure that this list has high quality. On the right side, you've got the candidates. So these are people who may want to be added to the list. So their expected behavior, they want to apply to be on the registry. And then of course, consumers, they are the ones who are actually using the list. So they are hoping to have the list that has, read the registry that has good quality value on the list. So you create a token. So we'll call this a curation token in the middle. You assign curation rights to the token. You grant access to the candidates. And so how does this work? So if I'm a candidate and I want to add my entry to the registry, I will submit my entry to the registry along with some tokens, sort of like a bond. The curators will look at that entry and collectively and in a consensus determine if the submission is valid or not. If they determine that the submission is valid, they allow the entry to go onto the list, retain a tiny bit of the tokens for their work, and return the rest of those tokens back to the original candidate. If the curators look at the entry and say, no, this is not a valid entry to the list, it doesn't belong on the list, then those tokens that the candidate submitted are lost, he loses them, and those tokens get redistributed to token holders. So that creates this economic incentive for candidates to be accurate in how they submit, and for curators to actually do the work to put things to the list. This is a very simple example of a token curated registry. There's obviously more nuances and things that need to be resolved, but this is just meant to inform and demonstrate an opinion. So that's the end of my presentation, I think. Yes? Oh yeah, one more quote. So this is from Alvin Roth. He's an economist at Stanford University. He won the Nobel Prize in 2005 for his work on market design and game theory. So market design is the engineering part of game theory. It's the underlying science of how the details work and how the parts fit together. We deal with much more games as humans, complicated games than the game theory usually deals with. And that's it. I'm Michael Wuehler. Thank you very much for enjoying. Thanks for your attention.